You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Bannock.
Welcome to the 30th and final episode of Season 4. We began the season some time ago in the autumn of 2022, and since then the show has featured some fabulous guests and discussed a wide range of issues on global development. During this period, we also managed to celebrate our 100th episode. I'm delighted that in this final episode of the season, my guest is none other than Francis Fukuyama, who recently visited the Basement Studio in Oslo. Some of you may have listened to my previous conversation with Frank in Season 2, when we discussed his major 2-volume work on the origins of political order and political decay, in addition to his 2018 book on identity politics. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Nomeleni Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, FSI. He's also a faculty member of FSI's Center on Democracy, Development and the Rule of Law, and directs Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy. He's also a professor of political science. In this episode, our focus was on Frank's latest book, Liberalism and its Discontents. Grounded in fundamental principles of equality and the rule of law, liberalism is a system for governing diverse societies and emphasizes the rights of individuals to pursue their own forms of happiness free from government encroachment. But classical liberalism is in a state of crisis and is now being challenged from both the political right and the left. In this latest book, Frank outlines some of the main reasons for the current state of crisis and offers a defense of a revitalized liberalism for the 21st century. Frank and I began by briefly reviewing the recent debate on democratic backsliding and how one ought to distinguish between liberalism and democracy. Thereafter, we explored the moral and economic justifications for liberalism and why it is now under threat. We concluded by examining the alternatives to liberalism, including the China model. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Season 5 is scheduled to air in September. Until then, thanks for listening, and I wish you a fantastic and relaxing summer holiday. Frank, it's good to see you in person. Welcome back to Oslo and welcome to the basement.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. It's great to be back.
The last conversation we had was when you were pretty pessimistic about democracy in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this was just before the election. Mm-hmm. And you were hoping, I think, that Biden would win. Mm-hmm. And things are perhaps different or more optimistic. Things are looking up. But I wanted to ask you firstly about this ongoing debate on democracy backsliding, democratic backsliding. And you know that there's been this enormous amount of debate, people actually questioning whether this is true or whether we should be really as concerned as we are. A lot of reports are saying democracies are backsliding. Others are pushing back and saying, hey, come on, the democracies are resilient, that we don't really agree on the conceptual or the measurement criteria. What is your take on that?
Oh, I don't know that there's much disagreement that there's been a lot of backsliding. You know, Freedom House every year publishes its Freedom in the World survey, and they show that democracy in the aggregate has been declining for 17 straight years. And I think VDEM and the other measures would all replicate. You know, The Economist tracks this. I think there's no question that there's been backsliding. The other thing that's important is a more qualitative measure, because it's really gone backwards in the two biggest and, you know, arguably most important democracies, the United States and India. And, you know, the decline of democracy in the United States has significance way outside the United States, because, you know, the United States for so long was a model for other countries and, you know, pushed itself as a model. And I think very few people look up to it anymore. And I think that therefore has a, you know, big impact. The other thing is that as America has become so polarized, it can't concentrate on other parts of the world. We have a lot of meetings. We just had an alumni meeting of our former Draper Hill Summer Fellows in Tbilisi, Georgia. And we had another event at Stanford last year where we brought a lot of these democracy advocates from around the world and started asking them about what they thought of American foreign policy. So these would be the most sympathetic, most pro-American people in their respective countries. And you wouldn't believe the amount of complaints that we heard. A lot of the usual things about hypocrisy, but I think a lot of it just reflected the fact that the U.S. isn't paying attention the way it used to in a lot of parts of the world. And so areas where I think some American diplomacy or even just a statement from the State Department or the White House would have actually called attention to a particular backsliding incident and, might have put a stop to it. That just doesn't happen anymore. And it's very strange because Biden, claims that the fight between autocracy and democracy is the defining issue of our time, and he's held these democracy summits for democracy, but it's like they're really not paying attention to what's going on. Like one example is Guatemala. So Guatemala, as you know, had this CICIG, this UN Commission on Impunity, that was successful in actually convicting a former president, several ministers, some very high officials, and then a new president was elected and he kicked them out. And actually, the former head of CICIG, Ivan Velasquez, I guess it is, then became the defense minister of Colombia. He is a Colombian. And so the Guatemalans issued a warrant for the arrest of, the Colombian defense minister. And it's just that kind of in-your-face, they just want to demonstrate that they could care less about democratic norms and they're just going to look after their own self-interest. And I just can't imagine that this would have happened, 10, 15, 20 years ago.
What I was trying to allude to, Frank, was that the debate is now between people who say there is, of course, evidence. Apparently, according to VDEM, US barely made it to a liberal democracy category. India is an electoral autocracy. But there are others who say it is more about stagnation, that it is, if you think about countries on the African continent, in Latin America, it is not so much a regression as much as a stagnation. You don't agree with that?
Well, I don't know. How do you define a stagnation? I mean, that's probably projecting a dynamic trend or the absence of a dynamic trend. But, I don't know how you'd know whether things are going to continue.
Well, they're saying that we don't agree on the measures of democratic, or just to measure how strong a democracy is. It is not so much a reversal, that these are sturdy institutions. They're not really reversing. It is more just stagnating.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I've not heard that line from anyone, but I think you'd have to debate that in individual cases rather than...
Well, I think most people actually agree that there is a recession, that there is backsliding. But in this context, you mentioned this just now, the role of international institutions, the role of the US is important here in terms of promoting democracies abroad. And the National Endowment for Democracy has been doing this for many years. It has been an important part of American foreign policy. But I've had recently on the show one of our good friends, Steve Krasner, and you know that he's written this book called How to Make Love to Despots. Mm-hmm. And he talks about why the U.S. actually has to change, that rather than promote democracy, one should promote good enough governance. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I don't know. This was not my favorite book that Steve wrote. I was around, when he was writing this book, and I know the basis of this argument that, a lot of it has to do with Iraq and Afghanistan and the fact that we thought that we could actually turn them into real democracies, and that was obviously a failure. And I think, his argument probably makes sense in those cases that if we had aimed a little bit lower just at stability, we would have executed very different policies. So, for example, instead of rewriting the whole Afghan constitution, you could have simply relied on a coalition of warlords, and as long as they promoted the peace, then, that would have worked better than what we tried to do in creating a kind of unitary government there. That may be the case, but, it overlooks a lot of the downsides to doing something like that, which would have been basically a lot of very unseemly, human rights abuses and, drug dealing by the people that you're supporting and, this sort of thing. And so I'm not sure that you actually could have accomplished that. And the other thing is that even in terms of just getting to stability, I'm not sure that we even know how to do that. So you could be settling for what you think is just is good enough governance, and you're actually, laying the grounds for really bad governance.
Because Steve says, he's very open about this, he says that nobody's going to really fight for good enough governance like you would fight for democracy. It's not going to appeal to the masses in the same way.
Well, not just the masses. I mean, it's not going to appeal to any of the elites. I mean, he and Carl Eichenberry ran this big project on civil wars, and they kind of made an argument along these lines and took it to Congress, and absolutely nobody liked it.
Right.
It's very hard to sell.
But Frank, 20 years later, Afghanistan isn't doing better, is it?
No, it's not doing better. I think, however, that, that's the one case where he probably could have made a case for having much more modest goals. I think the problem is that it's hard to gain, consensus on setting a lower goal and exactly what that would look like. And, you're going to have to still subsidize Afghanistan pretty massively. And then you're going to know that a fair amount of that is being stolen by somebody. And how long, and how sustainable is that kind of situation? And our American taxpayers actually going to put up with something like that? And I think it just is not politically a very feasible kind of strategy to implement. I think in Afghanistan, in retrospect, probably what we should have done is just gotten rid of al-Qaeda and fortified a number of local militias and indeed warlords, and then gotten out after a couple of years rather than trying to stay in for 20.
Some people say that just promoting women's empowerment, even though it didn't last longer than the 20 years, you've already ingrained in local society certain values that may have long-term implications.
Well, they could. It's very hard to say at this juncture whether they actually are going to, or whether that's simply going to be a passing phase, because there doesn't seem to be a lot of support for this outside of Kabul, and maybe one or two other, urban areas in Afghanistan.
What about Venezuela? Because it's not clear to me what the Americans are doing there. How can one get rid of Maduro?
Well, I don't think it's an unclear policy. I just don't think we've got very much leverage unless you actually are going to support a coup, which I think at this stage in our relations with Latin America, you probably better not do. Yeah, I mean, it's not the lack of a clear policy. It's not as if there was some way that we could have gotten rid of him if we had been more
supportive of the opposition, maybe?
Well, I mean, how supportive would you have been? You basically recognized Guaido and got all of your allies to recognize him as the legitimate government. He was given control of a lot of their assets that had been frozen overseas, Again, beyond something like direct military intervention, I'm not quite sure, what else you could have done.
Yeah. And sometimes maybe American approval or support can be counterproductive, right? Some people may not maybe support whoever America is supporting because America is supporting that person.
Well, yeah, I don't think that happened in Guaido's case, but I do think that, the rumor that Trump was contemplating a coup did actually have a very beneficial impact on Maduro. So I think that, there are things that we can do that would provoke, just the opposite of what we actually want.
So you're basically saying that Steve is wrong?
Yeah.
That we should actually still aim for the sky high?
No, I don't.
Democracy.
No, I think he's right. I just think that it's unrealistic to think that in the United States you can actually pull this policy off.
Yeah, he's very aware of that. So he said that this is not realistic. But democracy is something that we believe in and we should be promoting. And it is easier to get support from the domestic public for democracy promotion.
I would put the problem a little bit differently. I actually think that democracy is one of the easiest things to get to. We have a big international apparatus, to help countries hold pretty free and fair elections with international observers and this sort of thing. The hard thing is to actually create a modern state, a state that has the capacity to actually deliver services, to do it in an uncorrupt way, in a way that doesn't, make use of massive patronage and clientelism. That's the part that we really don't know how to do. And that's actually what's probably more important than actual elections in building a kind of modern country. That's really the kind of trade-off that you're talking about when you're thinking about good enough governance. Are you going to settle for something other than a modern state? Are you going to settle for one that has, pretty rampant corruption and, really doesn't do things very well? And maybe that's you're going to have to settle for that at some point in any event. But to make that your explicit goal, I think, is tough.
I found that to be also problematic because, how do you say we accept some form of corruption rather than saying what we are used to saying? We don't want any corruption. But moving on to this latest book, because last time you came on the show, we talked about political order, political decay, we talked about identity, and now you have this wonderful book that I have in front of me, Liberalism and its Discontents. Let me ask you first, Frank, often liberalism and democracy are seen to be interchangeable. They're used interchangeably. Mm-hmm. But you, of course, argue that should not be the case, that they mean different things. So what is it that is different from liberalism and democracy?
Well, liberalism, I think, properly refers to constraints on the power of the state that can be imposed by a constitution, by checks and balances, and fundamentally by a rule of law. And democracy really has to do with accountability to as broad a part of the public or the citizens of the state as possible. And those are really separate institutions. And so you can have a liberal autocracy, in certain respects. Singapore, some of the Gulf states, resemble that, where you have actually a fair amount of economic freedom. You have a certain amount of personal freedom. People can come and go and kind of live as they choose, but you don't have any kind of elections. And then you can have a illiberal democracy, which is what Viktor Orban claims that he's building in Hungary, where you have democratic elections, but they don't support a rule of law. Essentially, the executive can kind of get away with all sorts of abuses of power. And I think that both of those, you see examples of both of those. I think that, in the end, liberalism and democracy do support each other in the sense that if you start eroding the liberal constraints on power, then what most populist leaders do is then attack democracy itself. So Orban himself has used extensive gerrymandering in order to make sure that his Fidesz party doesn't lose any future elections. Donald Trump would have liked to weaken the bureaucracy, the attorney generals, or he would have liked to turn the attorney general into a weapon of his own so he could go after his opponents and then change the rules for the subsequent elections so that he would never lose another election again. So those two do end up being mutually supporting, but conceptually, they're quite separate. And I think when people use the word democracy, they're actually thinking about liberal democracy, which is a combination of both the rule of law institutions and the democratic accountability institutions.
So the East Asian states were good examples of governments that pursued liberal policies, economic policies, but were not democracies.
Yeah, they had... the other problem is that the definition of who is a citizen has changed over the years. And so America had a very strong rule of law and constitutional checks on power right from the beginning of the founding of the U.S. when the Constitution was ratified, but it only applied to white males, and indeed at the beginning it only applied to white males with property. And so in that sense it wasn't democratic at all. South Africa was similar. The white people actually had a pretty modern constitution and a modern set of institutions, but all the black residents of South Africa were disenfranchised. They didn't have the vote, they weren't full citizens, and the like. And the history of many of our modern democracies is actually starting with a structure of law that does establish things like an independent judiciary and, these constraints on executive power, but they do not empower any but a kind of privileged minority of the population. And so that's kind of a separate issue, that you actually have liberalism and you have democracy, but the understanding of democracy isn't, universal adult suffrage. It excludes, certain important parts of the population. Women didn't get a right to vote until, the 19th Amendment in the early 20th century in the United States. And, in a certain way, the United States didn't become a full democracy until the 1960s with the passage of all the civil rights laws and the Voting Rights Act and that sort of thing.
So the best solution, the best alternative is to have liberalism and democracy together as a part of liberal democracy.
You want them together because they are mutually exclusive. The historical pattern in the West has actually been to start with the rule of law institutions. It makes European development quite different from the development in a lot of emerging countries because, in a way, it's very difficult to build a rule of law, but I think one of the deepest traditions in Europe is a legal one. I wrote about this in the first volume of my Political Order series, that in many ways the rule of law was established in Europe with the discovery of Justinian's code in a library in northern Italy sometime in the 11th century that then became the basis for the civil code that governs most of continental Europe. It's an inheritance, from the Romans via Byzantium. And this institution occurred, many centuries before you had any democracy in Europe whatsoever. But it was very important in limiting the authority of kings. It really meant that monarchy and despotism in Europe, and especially in Western Europe, was much more constrained than it was in other parts of the world. And then you could build democracy on top of these kinds of legal constraints. And one of the problems, I think, in many developing countries like Afghanistan, is that you actually import democracy before you actually have a rule of law, and actually before you have a state even.
Many people have been arguing that maybe it is the development of strong institutions that precede elections, that free and fair elections are not the start of the process.
Well, that's definitely the historical pattern in the West. Trouble is, again, it's sort of like going for good enough governance. It's very hard to, you think about the situation after the invasion of either Afghanistan or Iraq, and can you imagine the Americans coming in and saying, well, we're just not going to have elections, for a long, long time because you folks aren't mature enough to have them, and we're going to start with rule of law, and then maybe in 25 years we'll consider holding elections. That just doesn't work in the modern world.
So do you think, Frank, some of the problem is because we have to convince people back home that what we are doing is good, even though we may be convinced that we should be speaking a different language?
Well, that's part of the problem. But I think it's a more fundamental issue that conceptually and cognitively we don't understand how we ourselves developed. We don't understand why you can't have all of these institutions simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I think that, that is the result of a process of historical amnesia where you actually don't remember the history of your own society and the way that the introduction of these institutions, took place. There's a saying of Gordon Brown's, that to the effect that the rule of law is very hard to construct, especially in the first few centuries. And he's right about that.
Yeah, so I think we often have this idea in Scandinavia, elsewhere, that we're somehow going to replicate this model that somehow has helped us become wealthy easily elsewhere. This is the typical modernization problem, that we want to export models that seem dear to us, our values, without necessarily doing the homework maybe. But it is, as you say, it's very difficult for a minister here to say we're going to support aid programs elsewhere where democracy, human rights, gender, etc. are not important. Or they're important, but they're not crucial. It's not a very good selling point.
Certainly not in a modern liberal democracy.
Yeah. Even though you may be convinced that this is not going to work, as was the case in Afghanistan. Going back to the book, the argument, of course, that you have is that liberalism has intrinsic and instrumental value. It is something that helps create peaceful societies. It has a moral value in the sense that it promotes human dignity, human rights, but it also has an economic value that historically liberal societies have been rich. And yet people are very discontented and unhappy. And these are people on the left of the political spectrum and on the right.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about liberalism? As I read it in your book, it's not so much the idea that is the problem, but it is the way in which liberalism has evolved.
Well, it's a combination of those things. I do think that a lot of the opposition to liberalism is that, a liberal idea was taken and then taken to extremes. So, on the right, this is neoliberalism, right? That
Exactly.
You have to have market economies to have a modern economy at all. But, in the 1980s and 90s, under the influence of neoliberals like Milton Friedman and, the whole Chicago school, you had this attack on any kind of state intervention in the economy and the dismantling of, not just state-owned enterprises, but a lot of the regulatory system that had controlled banks and financial institutions. And that really led directly to the financial crisis in 2008 and to a lot of inequality and, simply, bad outcomes, bad economic outcomes. And I think similarly, on the left, you had this basic idea that, in a liberal state, you preserve or you protect human autonomy, the ability to choose. And, this is, I think, accepted by many people when it comes to basic actions like your right to speech, to believe, to associate, decide where you live, who to marry, all of these sorts of freedoms are, universally desired. But, right now, this desire for autonomy, I think, is taken to unsupportable extremes. You look at right now the transgender movement, not the idea that you should tolerate somebody that wants to change their gender. I think in a liberal society, if that's what people want to do, they should have the right to do it. But there's an ideology that says that gender is completely socially constructed, and not just socially constructed, but individually constructed. So regardless of your biology, if you say that you're born a man and you say you're a woman, and vice versa. And this is the point where liberalism begins to leave the realm of common sense. And I think that a lot of the opposition to liberalism in developing countries comes because the first freedom that is exported is not the freedom to vote, it's not the freedom to speak out, not the freedom to debate things, publicly, not the freedom to criticize your government. It's all of this, gender kind of ideology, that's what Americans or Scandinavians seem to care about the most. And I think in a very, conservative society, they scratch their heads and they're saying, what the hell is going on?
So is it a matter of how one packages and sells the idea of liberalism?
That's part of it. I think that it's not just the packaging, but it's also the emphasis, So in Uganda, they have really big problems with fundamental rights, right to, oppose the government, right to speak out, basic freedom of speech, all of these things under Museveni have been...
An anti-gay legislation?
Yeah, well, but, so that's the point, is that it's only when they pass this and so I'm not defending that legislation whatsoever, but the only time President Biden speaks out about rights in Uganda is when they pass this particular bill. He's not complaining about Museveni squashing opposition, not being able to publish freely, all of these other freedoms.
But why is that, Frank? Why is it that certain things get the attention
and
not
others?
It's
just, it's what's trendy. I guess what I find very unself-reflective is the fact that, something like gay marriage was illegal. It was criminalized in the United States. Not just it wasn't. I guess it wasn't criminalized, but it was so beyond the idea of anybody that men could marry men and women could marry women that you didn't even consider that was in the realm of possibility 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, the idea changes very quickly with stunning rapidity among the elites in liberal societies. And then we turn around and look at, developing countries and say, well, you have to be like us. We've accepted this, so you have to accept this. And this is the point at which, in a country that doesn't have basic, services, that doesn't have the right to vote or the right to speak, If this becomes the tip of the spear in terms of liberal values, then I think a lot of people are going to say, what's going on here?
I think that there are two issues here, which also you raise in the book. One is the principle of universalism, that there's certain values, and this is the whole debate in human rights. There are always cultural relativist arguments saying we don't recognize that all human rights are universal. We get to pick and choose. So this principle of certain rights being universal is always being challenged. That's one point. The other thing has to do with the focus on the individual. In many of our societies, we think about ourselves as individuals, individual rights, whereas in some other parts of the world, it is more the group rights. So I want to sort of bring in your earlier work on identity. How is this playing out? So is the argument you're making that it is certain rights that get the attention, or the violation of certain rights that get the attention because they somehow have received acceptance now, but 20 years ago, gay rights weren't accepted? Is that the problem? Is it the disagreements about what is universal value and or not? Or is it also this focus on the individual rather than the group?
Well, I think both of those are points of contention, and they probably ought to be treated separately. I think that you've had this expansion over time of who qualifies as a rights-bearing citizen, and that's really been the central social struggle in the United States, because the only people considered citizens at the time of the ratification of the Constitution were white men with property. So Native Americans, African Americans, women were not given rights, and the big struggles has been to expand that circle of rights-bearing individuals, and therefore your understanding of who qualifies as a human being. And that's one set of issues. The issue about whether you recognize groups or individuals, I think, is a slightly different contest, where individualism is also something that is a historically contingent idea. And this is another area where I think Western people don't understand their own history. You have at the foundation of modern liberalism, what you might call these kind of foundation myths, the state of nature in Hobbes and Locke, which presumes that before civilization, people were simply atomized individuals looking out for their own self-interest, and society comes about only when they rationally decide that they need to cooperate in order to make their lives richer, safer, whatever. And I think that, anthropologically and historically, that's just completely wrong, that there was never a state of nature in which people were isolated individuals, that human beings are by nature such powerfully social creatures. And I talked about this at some length in the first volume of my Political Order book, that there's a continuity between mankind's primate ancestors and the behavior of, early human beings, where you have, essentially kin-based social organization in which primate behavior then evolves into human behavior, but it's all highly organized socially, and so there weren't really individuals in any point in that process. Individualism is a historically contingent phenomenon, and I had the most fun writing this part of the book. It actually develops, strangely enough, in England sooner than in any other European country. And, you go back actually to a very early point in the kind of early Middle Ages, where English people were already writing contracts in order to guarantee individual rights, including, an obligation to take care of your parents when they got old. And if you think about this, in a Confucian society or in India or in any other society, this idea that it's an individual decision to take care of your parents is just the most absurd thing, that you could possibly imagine. And yet the English were doing this, a millennium ago. But I think that individualism is one of those historically contingent things, just like the, modern natural science or the scientific method, that once it's invented, it then has a very great utility. And it's very hard to imagine having a truly modern economy, an efficient modern economy, without a high degree of individualism. If the basic economic actors are kin groups, where you basically have to deal with kin You have to give different prices to people that are relatives, and this sort of thing. I mean, you only trust people that you're related to. This has big negative implications for your ability to make an impersonal, large-scale market and therefore a modern economy. And so I guess my view is that, yes, individualism is something that appeared first in the West. It was even there historically contingent. People weren't always like this. But once it gets going, it becomes a kind of universal requirement for modernization. It's very hard to imagine a fully modern society that continues to be heavily kinship-based and sort of economically limited by that. And therefore, that's why, in every modernizing society, the modern sector is much more individualistic.
I wanted to just ask you about climate change, the climate crisis, because a lot of talk in this country, as I'm sure in many others, is about thinking less as an individual, thinking more as a group, a collective, in terms of reducing consumption. We should not just think about maximizing our own happiness, but there's something about the greater good. And so there is, I see, much more of an appeal to a collective identity. Is that something that you factor in this?
Well, no, because the kind of natural sociability where you see this continuum in behavior between, pre-human primates and human beings is not anything that global. There's no animal society where the individuals think, well, I'm part of the caribou race and I care about all caribous regardless of where they are, and therefore I'm going to do something that's good for all caribous or all, beavers or, all snakes. I mean, that's just not the way that natural sociability works. Natural sociability promotes friends and family, and that's the kind of natural social instinct that first of all, makes the development of modern impersonal institutions very difficult, but it also means that something like a global consciousness is itself extremely historically contingent.
So global public goods.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that before the late 20th century, nobody thought about stuff like this. Nobody thought in those terms. I think that as Europeans colonized the world and began to realize that there were civilizations beyond their own, and then the colonized began to realize there are these other people around the world, you gradually have this, expanding notion that, the human family is actually a lot larger than you thought it was, and you got to think about, other members of it. But that's a very, very recent and modern notion. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, people have always thought socially, but they never thought socially in these global terms. That's a very modern way of thinking about things. It's, in many ways driven by necessity. If you're dealing with something like climate, you really do have to have large-scale global cooperation. But I don't think that's it's not as if there's always been global cooperation and we've just somehow deviated from that, recently.
Frank, how much of this discontentment against liberalism is because of inequality? Neoliberalism, as you mentioned earlier, generated inequality in large parts of the world. I've had lots of guests on my show talking about Brexit and the rise of Trump. So you see that there were lots of people in many of these affluent societies who felt left behind. Is the economic reason more dominant in your scheme of things than other factors?
Well, I think that inequality is an important driver of populism. And it's certainly a consequence of unfettered market economics. And that's why I think that you actually do have to link liberalism and democracy, because if you don't have a reasonable equality of outcomes and not just opportunities, then, progressively you're going to get more and more inequality where the people, the have-nots, are going to feel increasingly resentful, and, it's going to delegitimate the system as a whole. So I actually think that, that's one of the reasons that you need not just liberalism, but liberal democracy, and that actually the whole kind of social democratic idea was the winning combination, in the late 20th century that actually stabilized modern societies, because You did rely on the market to produce wealth. You did, encourage entrepreneurship and risk-taking and competition and all that good stuff. But you also tried to limit the degree of inequality through redistribution, through various kinds of social protections. And that's a system that worked pretty well. And I think one of the problems with neoliberalism is that they took aim at those social protections and then tried to erode them. And that's what's led to the populisms on both the left and the right in large measure.
So what is it that the left is angry about with liberalism?
Well, that's something that's been changing because the left itself changed. I think in the 20th century, the left thought of inequality in these broad class terms. I mean, that's the way that Karl Marx, defined the problem of bourgeoisie versus proletariat. But, increasingly, the modern left interpretation of inequality has been much more based on identity categories and it's reasonable because, in fact, these identity categories were important, that, black people were not simply part of the proletariat. They, were marginalized deliberately because of their skin color. And women, similarly, had a very different role in the economy that was not determined by, their simple class orientation. And so this is the birth of, intersectionality and a lot of the more modern understandings of marginalization and deprivation, that it's based on these very specific and much narrower identity categories. And in that sense, it makes for a very different left agenda because it isn't really about broad policies that affect a very broad class of people like the working class, but it's really specific remedies to specific, marginalized groups. And that's, one of the big tensions, I think, now within the current left is which of these versions do you want to emphasize?
And on the right, there are people questioning facts and what is rational.
Mm-hmm.
Certain things that we should take for granted are being questioned, like, what works in relation to vaccines and all of that you experienced during the pandemic in the US. So there's an attack from both sides.
Yeah, I think that actually they join hands. So in one of the chapters of my liberalism book, I think that the attack on modern natural science actually starts on the left, and in particular with Michel Foucault, because, Foucault's writing was really about the way that, he said that in the old days, if you were a king or a dictator, you could simply kill your enemies, and there wasn't any constraint. But today, dictators don't do that. What they do is they use the language of science to build credibility and authority, and that masks an intention to marginalize certain groups of people. And he applied this, I think quite brilliantly to the mentally ill, to homosexuality, to criminals, that this was really science being used in the interest of a certain kind of social hierarchy, and that when you use the language of science, it wasn't just this objective set of rules for understanding empirical reality. It was really an instrument of power. And by later in his career, he was basically saying that everything is a matter of power. And I think that, that idea kind of underlies a lot of postmodernism and critical theory, and it's now drifted over to the extreme right.
When we think about the alternatives to liberalism, there really does not appear to be a very good alternative. Fascism and communism are out of the question, something that you concluded several decades ago. And when we last spoke, when we were talking about the end of history work of yours, you said there's one thing that you would do differently or write about differently. You had not factored in the rise of China. And China is, in many ways, the closest alternative, I suppose one could say, to liberalism. It is getting richer. There is more well-being. It is politically not free, but economically, at least until now, because of fast economic growth, unless it stagnates, things are looking pretty okay if you are a regular middle-class Chinese person. How do you see the China model going forward? Because I know that you've said this before, we've talked about this, that it does not seem very appealing for an African citizen to say, oh, I want a Chinese kind of society imported into my backyard. But there is this urge or this hunger to to travel to Europe or to the United States because of liberal freedoms and rights, etc. So is that still your argument that the China model is not attractive to people outside China?
Well, it's several things. So first of all, I think the China model just intrinsically is going to look less appealing because I think the economic model has really reached its peak and it's now in pretty serious decline. I think that, the Chinese claim that they are getting, like 3-4% growth, which is substantially down from the double-digit growth, 10 years ago, substantially down from the 7% growth, from before COVID, and substantially down from the 4 to 5% growth that they were predicting post-COVID. And I know a lot of economists that specialize in, looking at China that think their actual growth rate today is probably more like 1 to 2%, and that China could actually end up a lot like Japan in the 1990s, where for the next 20 years it sputters along at 0% growth, 1% growth, 2% growth, back to zero.
And the population is getting older.
Population is getting older. The number of working people in China is declining. For the first time in their history, they've got like 20% unemployment among college graduates. Virtually every province and municipality is broke. They cannot finance themselves. I mean, it's a very strange. I did an interview with Andy Walder at Stanford, a China expert, a sociologist, and it's actually he's very good on these issues. But China is a very strange economy for a modern economy. They have no property tax. And so all of these municipalities and counties and provinces have to fund themselves through land sales.
Yes.
And the demand for land has basically collapsed. And so these counties cannot make their payroll just to pay their civil servants any longer. And the central government doesn't want to bail them out. And it's become one of the most unequal societies anywhere on earth. It's got a higher degree of inequality than Brazil, which was always one of the
classic case of inequality.
And it's a strange thing that the Chinese just don't worry about inequality the way that Europeans do. If Europe had a Gini coefficient like China, it would be the number one issue that every politician would be talking about. But
well, it actually applies also to India. Inequality is increasing. But is your argument then that had there been continued economic growth in China, then it would form some sort of an alternative?
It would have looked better as an international model. I mean, we're not quite there yet, but in another 10 years, China, people will look at it and say, well, it's kind of a stagnating, kind of semi-rich country, and it'll never catch up to the United States. That's actually a pretty live possibility right now. But the other thing has to do with the social, cultural side of China. And that's where I think, I still believe what I was telling you earlier, that people don't want to escape to China.
But Singapore, Frank, Singapore is more appealing, right?
Well, Singapore is, but it's a freer society than China.
But they said it's a soft authoritarian state.
Much softer. Yeah, much softer. China could have developed like Singapore, and I think many people were hoping after Hu Jintao that the next leader would actually be more like Lee Kuan Yew, that people would have more personal freedom to come and go and to interact, deal with the outside world. And in fact, it's gone in the opposite direction. And I think that's really what makes the place really not that attractive.
So then if we don't have China, who else is there to compete against liberalism?
Well, there's plenty of would-be competitors. I just don't think that any of them are doing particularly well. I mean, nobody wants to be Iran or Saudi Arabia particularly. The other plausible societies out there are actually democracies. India's democracy is eroding, or the liberal part of liberal democracy in India is eroding. Brazil has got, plenty of problems. You might say that they're all in the democratic family, broadly speaking, in any event. So that's why I think that I'm still correct about the end of history, that I really don't see any, serious alternatives of a society where most people would look and say, wow, I think that's the future, and that's what we want to be eventually.
In a way, you've come full circle with this book. You're basically saying you were right along, and a lot of people were saying you were right. But I was thinking about something else in relation to India, Frank. I've been hearing this argument of late, especially because of the war in the Ukraine and India's support for Russia, or one would say, implicit support. And that is this idea that the Indian foreign minister has been articulating, that our problems are never seen to be Europe's problems, but Europe's problems are always supposed to be our problems. And so I notice in many countries, including in India, there is this projection of a strong identity, how important these countries have become as world powers. And that is important to convince a domestic audience that India is great, India is becoming more and more powerful. But outside, the discourse is somewhat different.
Well, certainly that's a big temptation, for any politician to try to use their standing in the world league tables, as a boost to your own domestic legitimacy. Whether that is something that is more generalized, I'm not sure. I mean, you have to be a pretty big country to think that you're going to be a model for other places. But there certainly is a lot of resentment of the fact that, your country is not being taken seriously by people in the developed world. And I do think that that's a spur to actually pushing yourself and, maybe changing your own institutions.
But that's where I think China has been very good at projecting its infrastructural capacity. We've talked about this, the Belt and Road Initiative. The India model of development is much more about democracy, actually. It projects the world's largest democracy, but also IT, education, and all of this. So do you think these are things that will help certain other countries come up with an alternative to liberalism? We can build infrastructure very quickly, and it's cheap, and it's good, and it lasts better, and it's better than what the Americans do.
Well, if that is a consequence of their being authoritarian, then that's a certain argument. I mean, right now, I think, in a way, the biggest challenge to liberalism is actually the one that's occurring in El Salvador. Because, El Salvador has been plagued by gangs, these maras, and their primary revenue source is extortion. They go around to virtually every business in El Salvador and say, you got to pay us a fee, otherwise you're going to get your legs broken, or your wife is going to get her legs broken. And so businesses pay, and they estimate that, the maras take in a greater percentage of GDP than is taken in by taxation by the legitimate state. And with the rise of Nayib Bukele, he basically has put, 10% of the youth population of El Salvador in jail, all these gang members, and crime has dropped by like 90%. And people in El Salvador love him, right? Because he is not following the rule of law, right? These people that are put in jail have not been given due process. They've not been convicted of a crime. They're just rounded up and put in jail. It's a little bit better than Duterte.
I was thinking of Duterte in the Philippines.
But Duterte killed a lot of people. He killed several thousand people, through extrajudicial killings. And Bukele hasn't engaged in that sort of thing. But he is putting a lot of people in jail, really without a trial. In Salvador, it's actually kind of easy to recognize a gang member by their tattoos. But, they're clearly scooping up a lot of innocent people.
Maintaining law and order, combating crime could be a powerful...
Well, the thing is that the problem in a place like Salvador is so extreme, and no democratic government has been able to solve that. They don't remotely have a way of dealing with this. And this is one of these things that I've written about in the political order books, that there are many aspects of a modern society that probably cannot be achieved by liberal democratic means. I don't think you can actually you can't create a modern nation by completely democratic means, meaning, this idea of having a common narrative and a territorially coherent country. Historically that occurred in modern democracies in a pre-democratic era through a lot of violence. I think that if you think about El Salvador, what is the solution to this debilitating, kind of crippling crime problem? And if you are a strict liberal that feels that you have to give everybody fair trial, due process, you're actually probably never going to solve that problem, right? And it's basically a kind of authoritarian, an elected authoritarian that has come up with a solution to this. And that, I think, is the real challenge, is that there are certain things that are important. There are certain outcomes that can actually be better solved by authoritarian means rather than by liberal means. And I don't think we've actually kind of taken this challenge all that seriously. There's another one that I encountered. I was in Moldova last fall, and they inherited this extremely corrupt judiciary from Soviet days. They've been involved in some major scandals where, you have a couple of oligarchs that basically ran these criminal schemes and it's a tiny country and they managed to suck billions of dollars out of it. And right now, what they really need to do is be able to just fire all of their judges and replace them by better ones, newly trained, better judges, but they can't do it because the Venice Commission says, that's going to violate judicial independence. Political authorities can't just fire judges arbitrarily. And, that's another example of procedures overwhelming outcomes.
So a solution to this is, of course, what Indira Gandhi did in India, 3 years, I think, of emergency, suspending democratic rights. Is that the way forward?
Well, it all depends on how that's managed, because I do think that there are times when if you use these kinds of emergency powers, you use them effectively, and then you end the emergency, then that might be acceptable. Jerry Brown did this in California. We have this law called CEQA, this California Environmental Quality Act, that prevents anybody from doing anything. It makes it very easy to litigate against almost any project in the state. And in order to actually get things done, Jerry Brown declared, you can do this legally under the California state constitution, but he declared a drought emergency and then suspended CEQA in order to get some housing projects through. And so if you can do this within a broader framework of law, that might be acceptable. The trouble is that once you start using emergency powers,
you can't stop.
Yeah, it's hard to know where to stop. And I think if you wanted to criticize Bukele, that's the criticism, is that he's simply going to become a full autocrat, having gotten used to being able to exercise this kind of authority. And he's not simply going to solve the gang problem, but he's going to keep himself in power indefinitely because he's managed to suspend the rule of law. And that's a legitimate argument. But I do think that there are times when countries face problems that are so dire in a certain sense that, you have to look a little bit beyond strict proceduralism, when you're thinking about what are possible solutions to those problems.
I know that you are worried about AI and its reach.
Well, I'm actually not that worried.
You're not worried? Okay, I thought you were. In terms of democracy, it could be a problem.
Well, it can be a problem in a couple of specific ways, in terms of deep fakes and decreasing trust in what you see, in front of you, and targeted advertising. There are aspects to it.
Or the power of the state to control its citizens.
Monitor. But we're not doing that in the West. They're doing that in China, but I think that's really not an imminent threat in most democracies.
But it's going to be a big thing. What else, if we were to conclude this conversation in terms of thinking ahead, Frank, what are the areas you think requires more research, more attention? Where should the focus of our students, our researchers, colleagues around the world, where should those be? What are we missing out? What should we be highlighting even more? Could be on democracy, on development. Where are the sort of burning issues?
There's some obvious ones. I think this rift between the global South and the West, is one that is important and it's growing. And, ideas for how to fix that, I think, are not really available right now. Obviously, it's not just AI, but there's a whole raft of technologies that are going to bring about really big changes. And I think we need to think through a lot of that. We still haven't figured out how to regulate the internet, so those are some areas. But, whether those are massive failures, I'm not quite sure.
I just read that the UN Secretary General wants an international sort of organization to control AI.
It's not going to happen.
Exactly. But it's made the news. But in terms of democracy and development, and talking about the global South, you're not worried about the influence of certain other non-democratic forms of government in African countries?
Oh, no, I am worried about that. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that China selling surveillance equipment, is bad. I don't think they should do this, and I don't think countries should buy that technology from them.
And what about infrastructure?
Oh, that's fine. If the Chinese want to build bridges and airports and that sort of thing, I say more power to them.
But the Americans are very critical of China, and yet
Well,
they
yeah,
aren't
but
doing enough.
Yeah, they're not offering an alternative. So I think they got to figure out how to actually play in that space. But until they do, I don't think it's right to criticize China.
So the next 10 years, what do you think is the picture like for the world in terms of global governance, in terms of resolving global challenges, in terms of doing anything about the climate?
I have a definite opinion about climate, which is that we have been paying too much attention to the international dimension, that the really big obstacles are all on a national level. You think about the United States, we just passed this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is really a big climate act for the first time that's going to allocate serious resources to it, but we can't spend those resources because it's too difficult to permit power lines or wind farms. It takes 10 years on average to get a wind farm approved in the United States. And if you think there's a big climate emergency and you're waiting around, 10 years to get a permit to even break ground on the project, how much adaptation are you going to do, or mitigation? So I think that, these are really big issues. And basically in every country, it's the domestic incentives or unaligned incentives that really create the biggest obstacles to actually dealing seriously with climate. And I don't think any number of kind of empty promises made at COP meetings is really going to solve that problem, especially, these declarations that you're going to be carbon neutral in 4 decades. I mean, no politician is going to be around in 4 decades. And so who's going to hold you accountable if you don't fulfill that promise? So that stuff is easy to say, but it doesn't actually lead to real action. And I think that the real action on climate really needs to take place at a lower level.
Frank, this was great fun. Thanks so much for coming to my basement today and for this chat.
Okay, sure. Thanks for having me.
So now it's time for dinner.
All right. Very good.
Thank you. If you enjoyed this conversation, please spread the news among friends and colleagues and share the link to the podcast on social media. You can tag us on Twitter at GlobalDevPod and Dan Bannock.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Bannock from the University of Oslo's Center for Development and the Environment. Please email your questions, comments, and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.